much. Without further ado, I want to call the next chair of the session challenging the cyberspace. The chair of this session will be Dr. Dorit Dor. She is the Vice President of Products at Checkpoint Software Technologies. Dorit, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Clicker, here's the clicker. Very good. So, hi everyone. Today we are going to go much higher from a specific technology or a specific threat, and we are trying to explore the macro level of cybersecurity in different ways. I'd like to use this time to introduce great panelists, and I know we are short in time, so I'll spend very little time on my own, but introducing myself. That's my 22nd year at Checkpoint, and we're not going to talk about any technologies in particular, but the things I've seen flowing around over the past 22 years make us need to look at the macro level and understand how we take the commercials and the national aspect at the very high level to the next step. So if I take 3 examples, and I'm not going to go over the example, then one example would be Ukraine, which is the training environment for the Russian, both from electricity attacks, as many people stated before me, and as well as election things. We've just learned that the Russians try to change the election in Ukraine as a way to change the elections elsewhere, and we know these places. And then we'll take a second example, and the example would be how we deal with IoTs, CCTVs, attacking the internet and making huge attacks that just stop the operational environment of all of us. And from that, real macro level, we'll go one step down into an hospital and how a ransomware attack can really prevent medical assistance to myself or to anyone else in the medical place. And this is not going into the details of these stories, but if I'm trying to take it to the next level, I will try to ask myself, what do I take from this? Which one of these is a national attack? Which one of these is a company commercial issues? Which one of these is my personal issue? If we look at the comparison of the physical world, then there is army and law enforcement, and I may call the police if somebody gets into my house. But what do I do here? Is the medical thing something for me? Is it something if something attacks all the hospitals? Is it something for the nation? And if I look at nations, what do they do today? Then they do a certain list of things. Typically, they'll have a CERT, they'll have a SOC, they'll try to do some regulation, they collaborate on law enforcement. Is it really stopping the attacks? Is the world a safer place out of this? When I put myself into the hospital, do I feel safer as a result? So these are the things we could think about. So even if I told you, and I had the best intelligence, and I told you that something is going to happen tomorrow, what would my nation do about it? What would the police do about it? Maybe they will arrest the guy after, but if my surgery got delayed, what can I do about it? So, in my opinion, we have to think about the bigger picture. We have to sense, we have to analyze, but we also have to protect and prevent. And I have a very, very distinguished list of speakers. Each of them is an expert in his field. And I'll pass this through right on to the first speaker, who's Michael Daniels. Michael Daniels was a former special assistant to the President Obama. He's also today the president of the Cyber Threat Alliance. The Cyber Threat Alliance is a very unique alliance. In the alliance, partnering many competitors such as Checkpoint, Palo Alto, Fortinet, Cisco, Symantec, and McAfee, and just imagine the collaboration gets created by this. So we are part of the founding members of the Cyber Threat Alliance, and this is really something that try to take a different approach. So he will bring both the nation, aspects of working with Obama on regulations, etc. And I welcome Michael Daniels. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dorit, for inviting me to participate on this panel today. Thanks, everyone in the audience, for coming to listen. As Dorit said, we're going to talk a little bit more at a higher level about the challenges in cyberspace. What actually are the challenges that we face, and why is this problem hard? And then how can we actually play the game differently? From my perspective of both being at the White House for 4.5 years and for now being in the private sector with the Cyber Threat Alliance, it's kind of like we're in Las Vegas and we're playing against the house. And we all know what happens. The house always wins. And so that's not a game I want to play anymore. So I actually want to play a different game. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we play a different game at the end. So the strategic context, we all know it's not good, right? The threat will continue to get worse. We've talked about that. You've heard from several of the speakers yesterday and today about how the Internet of Things is growing, how the number of actors in cyberspace is increasing. All of those things are making it get worse. And states and criminal groups are going to continue to expand their activities in cyberspace. So those first two reasons are actually very obvious for why the strategic context is so bad and is getting worse. But there's a third reason that we don't give as much credence to. And that is because the analogies and models that we use to talk about cyberspace all come from the physical world. And they're all wrong. The physics and math of cyberspace, as those of you that work on the technical end of this know, are completely different. A light-speed nodal network operates very differently than the rules of the physical world. And we have not fully internalized that into how we are using the mental models that we approach cyberspace with. So when I was in the White House, I would often get asked about, well, can't we just treat cyberspace like border security and have the federal government provide border security for the United States? And I would say things like, okay, well, would you like us to put some NSA boxes on your network? Oh, no. Would you like us to build the Great Firewall of the United States? No. So what do we actually mean? We don't know what we mean when we talk about that. That's because the border security model is wrong. The borders and boundaries in cyberspace, they do exist, but they don't follow the international boundaries that we have. They're where networks touch each other. They're peering points. They're firewalls, routers. And so it's actually more like everybody in the entire United States, for example, lives on the Rio Grande. So in that kind of world, how do you assign border security to one particular group? Or another analogy, like missile defense. We talk a lot about that. In 4.5 years in the White House, I never once had anybody come running to me and say, if you don't do something in the next 30 minutes, the bad malware is going to hit. The flaming ball of cyber death is coming right at us. Never happened. I either got, we've discovered that we were had 18 months ago, and have been being had ever since, or we've got intelligence that somebody somewhere might do something in a few months. So the idea that we're going to be able to sort of interdict malware as it's coming in like some sort of missile is just not going to work. So the physics and math of cyberspace mean that we need to come up with some new mental models, some new constructs for how we're thinking about cyberspace. Because if we don't, we'll continue to get the problem wrong. Now, it's not all bad. The fact is that all the malicious actors face some constraints. First of all, Hollywood does not equal real life. I know all of you have, all of us have seen the shows where they flip open the laptop and with 3 keystrokes they've hacked into whatever, right? The truth is that doing something to somebody somewhere randomly on the internet, yes, that's easy. But having the specific impact that you want at the time and place of your choosing, and only the impact that you want, is still really hard. So it actually requires effort on the part of the bad guy. Second, we actually don't really know what collateral damage means in cyberspace. So from a broad perspective, we don't know when we launch something what its ultimate effect is going to be. And so from the nation state perspective, this puts some constraints on them. But even for the bad guy perspective, they've got to be careful about what they do in many instances if they don't want to get discovered. All of the bad guys actually also face capacity limits. There are only so many people. Yes, a lot of it is automated, but they face a capacity constraint in that there are only so many smart people to actually do the development of new malware and new coding. But what I mean by restricted action sequence is that if you've got a goal of stealing money or stealing information to turn into money, there are certain things you have to do in order to achieve that goal. Now, nation states face some additional constraints. One of them is the intelligence dilemma. The fact of the matter is that most nation states are reliant on their intelligence apparatuses in order to actually carry out their cyber operations. And so they always face a dilemma. Do I do something? Do I take an action that would expose my sources and methods and compromise my ability to collect intelligence or do other things? Or do I stay quiet? And that is a dilemma that all of the nation states face. There's the third country conundrum. If you're going to take action against another nation state or its cyber operations, you're often actually talking about doing it in a neutral third country. Because if you want to go after a nation state's operations, they're often spread around the planet. And if you're trying to interrupt them or disrupt them, you're talking about carrying out activities on a box or a machine that's in some third country. And that poses some interesting foreign policy and diplomatic concerns. And then lastly, in order to actually be really effective at using cyber as a tool of statecraft, you actually need to integrate it with all the other tools of statecraft. So in order to actually make it effective, you've got to do that integration process. And that's actually not easy. And most countries find that very, very difficult to do. And that actually, that lack of integration often hinders the ability of nations to be truly effective. So given this strategic context and given where we are, how do we actually change the game? How do we actually not play the same old game? So I'm going to give you 3 examples of how I think we actually need to change the game to play something a different way. So the first thing is we actually need to change how competition occurs in the cybersecurity industry. For a very long time, the cybersecurity industry has competed on the basis of, I know something you don't know. It's competed on the basis of what I call hoarded information. But the truth is that nobody's set of information is ever going to be big enough. So instead, what we want to do is actually encourage a change in the competitive landscape. We want our cybersecurity vendors to compete. We want our cybersecurity companies to compete very hard. But we want them to compete on the basis of, I do better things with the data than you do. I'm faster. I understand your business model better. I integrate with your stack better. I'm cuddlier. Whatever the competitive advantage is. But we want them to compete on that basis on a broader set of shared information. And if we do that at speed, at scale, that will enable us to begin to get inside the bad guy decision loop so that we can actually begin to get ahead of what the bad guys are doing. In effect, actually taking the internet and cyberspace and making it work for us rather than against us. The second thing is that we actually need to start thinking about this in terms of particularly for the criminal groups, actually undermining their business model. Not just going after their malware or their command and control nodes sort of on a one-off basis, but actually going after their entire business process. We want to undermine their business model so that we're focused on disrupting them for the maximum effect for the maximum amount of time possible. In essence, we want to make them have to do a lot of business process re-engineering over and over and over again to raise the level of costs on them to the point where the low-end guys we can drive out of the market and we can impose significantly higher friction costs on the more sophisticated adversaries. And then lastly, you've heard a lot from some of the speakers yesterday, particularly about how governments need to get more aggressive about imposing costs and disrupting what the adversaries are doing. And I agree with that. But we need to be able to coordinate the actions between government and the private sector much more effectively. And I'm not talking about authorizing hackback, letters of marque and reprisal, because I think that's a terrible idea. But I think that we can do a better job of using the comparative advantage that both governments and the private sector have to enable the coordinated response to cyber threats so that we can do a much better job over time of disrupting those adversaries for a longer, on a longer term basis. So just to close, I would say that the situation we all know is getting bad, but we want to play, but we've been trying a lot of the same things for the last 15 or 20 years. And now we're at the point where we actually really do need to play a different game. And so if I can leave you with anything, it's that we need to be trying some of these things that you see on the screen behind me so that we actually do something different and go after the problem in a completely different way. Thank you very much for letting me come and speak with you today.
I want to ask you a question. So
Sure.
how do you allocate the responsibility between the government and the private sector? Do I protect myself as a private sector and you just go after the bad guys afterwards? Or how do we split up?
So I think that the allocation of responsibility between governments and the private sector is actually one of the key public policy questions that particularly in the West, we actually need to answer. I think that we need to look at some different models in the sense of perhaps we treat it like disaster response. Particularly in the United States, if we have, all disaster response starts locally. And if a hurricane is coming, you're still responsible for ensuring that you've done the right things to protect your house. But if the storm is bad enough, then you're going to get to progressively higher and higher levels of government getting to intervene. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to think about things like that. The division is never going to be sharp and precise. Mm-hmm. It's always going to be a sliding continuum.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
There's no better speaker to speak about the private sector, Dave DeVault. I have the pleasure to introduce Dave DeVault, the former chairman and CEO of both FireEye and McAfee, and a very distinguished speaker by himself. Welcome.